Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How do we define human rights? What is the United Nations Human Rights Office doing to promote and protect human rights worldwide? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're going to take a look at human rights, an issue that affects all 7.3 billion on planet Earth. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Mr. Ivan Simonovic. Mr. Ivan Simonovic, a Croatian national, is the United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. Mr. Simonovic is a diplomat, politician, and legal scholar who previously served as the Croatian ambassador to the United Nations. Your Excellency, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Happy to be with you.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's get right into it and talk about the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights. We'll cut that title down a little bit as we go along. What exactly is it? When was it formed? And what is your main mission?
Human Rights Office has been established as a consequence of the World Conference on Human Rights that has taken place in 1993. There was a strong push to do something for better protection of human rights, and the office has been established in its current form. And we have gone a long way since then, and nowadays we have 53 field presences, 53 different locations in the world where we are present in one form or another.
And how do we, human rights, I know the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came online December 10th, 1948, but human rights has changed over the last 60-some years, has it not? How do you
we are increasing the threshold.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. How do you broadly define human rights?
They are universal entitlement, meaning that you do not have to do anything to deserve your human rights, just to be born as a human being. You are entitled to certain rights, right to food, right to education, right to be free from torture, and this is what human rights are all about.
Exactly. And our viewers, if they'd like more information on human rights in your office, they can go to www.ohchr.org and get much more information about what we're talking about.
We are happy to have as many hits as we can.
This may bump them up. Let's hope, right. Let's talk in general terms too. How do you, I know we're going to get into specifics, but how do you generally promote and protect human rights as an agency of the United Nations?
Well, there are various ways to do it. Some of those ways are more welcomed by member states. Some of them raise concerns. Technical capacity building is an important part of our work. So we try to explain, to provide human rights education, to strengthen national mechanisms, strengthen civil society, their understanding and involvement in human rights. But we'd also do monitoring and reporting, meaning that we report on human rights violations, and we quite often do it publicly. So when it is not possible to successfully raise it with government, then sometimes we're involved in naming and shaming.
And so in that overview that you just gave a minute ago, that would protect your rights, my rights, and people living
Absolutely.
in many
all
far-flung
your
areas of the
viewers
world.
are our clients.
Exactly, most assuredly, yes. Well, one area there we talk about human rights is in the area of violent crimes, murder, that type of thing. And of course, when you think of that, you think of the punishment that often evolves out of that, and it leads us to capital punishment is what it leads us to. And I know you recently issued a major report, a study on capital punishment and the whole issue of how it's important to move away from capital punishment. In fact, we have a copy of it right here, and I want to make sure I get it right, but this is Moving Away from the Death Penalty, which is your recent publication.
Arguments, trends, and perspectives.
And perspectives, right.
Yeah.
And I noticed you had the trends on the back side, which shows
Yeah.
that they're going up, which is very good.
Moving away, in fact,
Yes,
it
please.
goes down, as you see.
That's right, it's
This
going
is
down.
this is 1975 number of executing states, and this is where we are now.
Oh, very good. So it's
Yeah.
going down. It's even better.
Going up.
That's right. Not for executions. Going up the number of countries who are abolishing executions.
Exactly.
That's right.
Either
That's
in law, in practice.
That's what I meant to say,
Yeah.
but it didn't come out
Good,
that way. But anyway, let's talk about this. Why is capital punishment, why is it so important to focus on this, and what are the trends right now of us moving away from capital punishment?
Trend is definitely all over the world in moving away from the death penalty. Part of it is just a formal abolition of death penalty through legislation changes. But some member states retain death penalty in books, but do not execute. And now, if you would look into the global picture, 105 states have abolished death penalty legally, and another 60 are not executing. So greatest number of member states are not executing anymore. However, disturbing trend is that some member states that are retaining death penalty have been increasingly passing death sentences or even executing them.
Exactly. And so often we hear that some people say, well, we have to have retribution for some violence, some heinous crime that may have been committed. Somebody murdered 15 people or something like that. What is the argument, the counter argument to that, to say that it's more humane not to do it, but you can still get some retribution from that person in some way, shape, or form?
When speaking about advantages and disadvantages of death penalty, what is always quoted as an advantage is that you are avoiding wrongful convictions. There is no legal system that is immune from wrongful convictions. I'm former Minister of Justice, and I know that no matter how much you try, some wrongful convictions do occur. And it was practically proven by DNA testing. And many exonerees here in the United States are clear proof that wrongful convictions do happen, and death penalty is irreparable. If you executed a person, you cannot correct a legal mistake. Secondly, if you analyze who end up being executed, quite often in many states it is related to some sort of discrimination. All over the world, the general trend is that it's poor people, usually members of minorities, migrants, disadvantaged population. The arguments for retaining the death penalty, basically it's two of them. One is deterring effect. So the death penalty would deter crime, and there is no empirical evidence that death penalty does deter crime. In member states in the United States that have moved away from the death penalty, crime rate didn't increase. If you reintroduce death penalty, crime doesn't go down. So no empirical evidence of deterrence. And on retribution, it's really a difficult thing. And again, I will use US statistics. Out of intentional homicides, just 2% end up in death penalties of intentional homicides. So, you know, the existence of death penalty being passed to someone else and not to the murderer of your beloved ones leaves you frustrated. And even for those 2% that are convicted, we are having a situation that most of those death penalties are not executed. So passing a death sentence, which is then, if executed in some 12 years, which would be the average waiting, well, it's just like passing to a thirsty man a glass of a salty water. So when you see the frustration when you talk to some family members, quite often you hear that at the end of the day, the postponement of the decision on death penalty or execution was postponing the closure, psychological healing of the victims, family members.
Exactly. And the statistics do bear that out, that that's very low as far as the number of people actually being deterred if they know they're going to get the capital punishment. Secondly, as I recall, I've seen statistics saying it's much more expensive. For example, in the United States, which has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, not just in this hemisphere, but in the world, it is much more expensive to go through this whole legal process
in the
of
United
capital
States,
punishment.
no doubt, it's much more expensive, different in different states,
Sure.
to execute than to have life without parole, for example. In some other states, it may be cheaper, but it's because of lack of legal safeguards. Then increases the likelihood of wrongful convictions. Only if you have sophisticated judicial review, you do not eliminate, but you decrease likelihood of wrongful conviction, and that makes death penalty a very expensive sentence.
Exactly. And many states in the United States, we'll just use this as an example, I'm sure other countries could probably have similar examples, but have said that they've discovered that because of DNA testing, excuse me, that type of thing, that they have found many people on death row who are innocent. They are not guilty of the crimes they've been prosecuted
Definitely.
for.
Some
In
of
one
them
state,
were our guests at the panel discussions.
is that right?
Damien Echols or some others who were here in the United Nations, in the building, at the panels, testifying of their experiences of being innocent and convicted.
Just recently we read where I think Saudi Arabia executed 47 people,
Yeah.
one a very popular Iranian cleric, and of course there was
Nimr
a huge,
al-Nimr. Yeah.
a huge outroar over that. The High Commissioner for Refugees in your office came out against it. What could be the follow-up of that? What will be the follow-up?
Well, the problem with that execution from the perspective of United Nations is, first of all, we are against death penalty. As Secretary General put it, there is no place for death penalty in the 21st century. It's a cruel and degrading punishment. But the other problem is that there were many allegations that some of those who were executed did not stand a fair trial, that there were some torture victims among executed. And about Nimr al-Nimr, the problem is that from the information that we possess, he was executed for something that should not be considered most serious crimes. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights limits the scope of death penalty only to most serious crimes involving personal involvement in murder, which certainly was the case with Nimr al-Nimr. So quite a lot of concerns.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to see previous programs. Also, if you're involved in any type of media activity, be it a website with a PBS, community access television station, or whatever it might be, you're encouraged to go to the broadcasters page and download the programs, and you're invited to use them free of charge. We provide them as a public service. Today we're taking a look at the very important area of human rights, and my guest is an expert in this area. My guest is Mr. Ivan Simonovic, and Mr. Simonovic is the UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. There are so many areas we could go to around the world to talk about human rights violations, but let's just, if you could just focus on maybe two or three. We talked about the Saudi Arabian case, but are there two or three just so violent, or let's say egregious, acts of human rights violations that come to the surface right now? It may be with Syrian refugees, it may be in other areas, but I'm sure there are some that we could focus on.
I would identify two broad areas as especially problematic. One is extreme poverty. You know, today we have over 10% of people who live on less than $2 a day. try to imagine how their life looks like and how are their human rights affected by extreme poverty. This is from economic and social sphere, but civil and political rights, you are quite right, are quite often violated during violent conflicts. And unfortunately, after Second World War, we have had about 20 years where there were fewer and fewer civilian casualties of conflict. From 90s to 2010. From 2010, every year we have more civilian victims of violent conflicts. And, of course there are differences. Currently in Burundi, we have hundreds of civilians being killed. In Yemen, we have thousands of civilians being killed. In South Sudan, we have tens of thousands, and you're quite right, Syria, Iraq, we have hundreds of thousands who were killed. So those would probably be extreme poverty and violations related to violent conflicts would be the most, the reasons for our most concern.
There are some other areas too we're starting to read more about over the past couple of years. Perhaps it's getting more publicity, but look at the areas of forced labor, that type of thing, child marriages, female genital mutilation. Are you involved in those, looking at those particular areas?
Very
because
much
that
so.
Seems like it would be horrific violations of a person's human rights.
Oh yes, and it is possible to influence that. You mentioned female genital mutilation. The trend is really positive. We are having some successes working together, United Nations, as well as member states. There is a number of member states who are introducing legislation penalizing female genital mutilation. We have international and national civil society actors who are active in this arena. So I would say capacity building, education, helping drafting legislation which prevents all those violations are certainly activities that we are involved in, as well as global advocacy against those violations, and if necessary, submitting public reports condemning member states who are involved and supportive of those human rights violations.
Exactly. Now, we saw this past September that the United Nations General Assembly, the 193 countries, came on board and signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals, which were an offshoot of the Millennium Development Goals. Excuse me. And they're going to run through 2016 through 2030. The development agenda, was your office involved in the development of those Sustainable Development Goals, and such as ending all forms of poverty, promoting education, ending hunger, those types of things?
Yes, definitely. And in this respect, there is quite an improvement when compared to Millennium Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals are underpinned with human rights. If there would be one core message of Sustainable Development Goals, it is that development matters if it contributes to better lives of people. So it's not just numerical indicators of the economic growth, but improvement of social services influencing the lives of real people. Something that we cared very much, and we are very happy that is part of Millennium Development Goals. It's the idea of ending any form of discrimination, because discrimination negatively affects economic development. If you do not have full possibility of women to participate in economic life, it negatively affects economy. If you do not find a way to enable people with disabilities to also involve in economic life, it's bad for economy. It's bad, of course, for people who are affected, but it's bad for economy as well. So the idea of leaving no one behind in the development process is essential for Sustainable Development Goals.
And when you mentioned discrimination and mentioned women in the same sentence, that brought to mind the CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Why is this an important United Nations convention? And a large number of countries, the majority, have adopted it, have they not, at this point?
It's just a handful of countries that have not. Unfortunately, US is one of countries that did sign the convention, but it has not been ratified. In fact, US was very fast in signing it, just 1 year after the convention has been passed in time of Carter administration, but it's stuck since then. CEDAW is a comprehensive instrument that does provide for guidance on how to move away from discrimination against women. It also created a CEDAW committee. So you have CEDAW Convention as international binding instrument for signatories, and you have committee consisting of experts that review whether member states are abiding to their obligations, and they issue recommendations, and this is a process which leads to improvement of women's rights all over the world.
And as you mentioned, that was during the Carter administration. I think it was CEDAW has been languishing in the U.S. Senate since 1979, as I recall.
You are quite right.
And it
I think from 80, but
81.
It doesn't. Yeah, all the same.
A year here and there.
79 was when convention was adopted, and I think that U.S.
It was signed shortly after that. Yes, and of course there are other conventions too. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on
Rights of People with Disabilities,
exactly,
which
disabilities.
Unfortunately did not go through recently.
Right. And the interesting thing about the U.S. Senate, we won't focus on it too much, but the U.S. already has laws that are even more stringent or higher. Let's say a requirement is a bit higher than what's in the convention, but so often the members of the Senate misinterpret how they really read the conventions, and so that's one of the sticking points. And of course there's ideology involved in it too, but we've been talking about some of the problems with human rights and that type of thing, and you have certainly have more than you, I'm sure, than you can handle. You have quite a few. What are some of the successes? There are best practices out there. I'm sure you've seen improvements. You were talking about how countries are coming on board to eliminate capital punishment, that type of thing. Are there some successes that you would like to mention today?
Yes, I would say that the essence, something that is present in all countries that are progressing in human rights area, is based on a couple of very, very simple points. First of all, it's inclusion. Inclusion meaning that every person can have a say in running their political life, in running legislation that affects them. And secondly, and very much related to that, there is no discrimination. There is no group that is put to a disadvantage. That is the essence of human rights.
Exactly, it certainly is, yes. And this is such an important area, and we need to focus more on it. As we look at in the future now, you have a lot of events going on at the United Nations, but you have a lot going on around the world too. December 10th is Human Rights Day. The Declaration of Human Rights was signed in 1948. There are literally thousands of activities taking place around the world focusing attention on that. How important was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? And in a sentence or two, what exactly was it when it came online?
You know, let us try to get back to the time when it was passed. It's after the Second World War and horrors of the Second World War. So they offered through Universal Declaration a vision of a better world based on respect of human rights, civil and political as well as social and economic. And it has turned to be a Bible of human rights. It was not a legally binding instrument, but through years it transformed into legally binding covenants and then other conventions. And if I would have to illustrate significance of the Universal Declaration, and speaking of Bible, it has been translated into 465 languages.
Really?
It's the most translated document ever in history. So
that is quite an accomplishment. It is. In the last minute that we have, what do you see as the major challenge in the area of human rights as we move forward?
Two of them. One of them is resources devoted to protection and promotion of human rights, and secondly, lack of political will of some states. And in fact, you can always do something then with civil society, with national human rights institutions. But unfortunately, currently we are facing some threats to human rights and human rights defenders through reprisals against
Exactly.
them for standing for human rights.
Exactly. And of course, our viewers, as I mentioned before, can go to your website at ohchr, I believe, .org. I had to think on that one for a moment.
We must find a
shorter one,
simpler abbreviation.
But no, these are very important issues that you're dealing with, and I really, Mr. Ivan Simonovic, really appreciate you coming today to talk about this, and hopefully people will Google CEDAW and will look into the human rights issues, because as you mentioned, all you have to do is be born to have human rights, and we all want to protect our human rights and make sure that they're not violated. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and I wish you and all your viewers a very human rights friendly 2016.
Thank you. We appreciate it. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.